it's Doll Fairy again, back with another edition of BJD Weekly. On this week's video, I'm going to be talking about how to choose a doll based on aesthetic preferences and whether or not, size matters. Size being, doll size. I've merged sort of the two topics into one so that you can get a more cohesive idea of two things that you should be considering in tandem when deciding on what BJD you want to order. So to start off, I'm going to talk a little bit about aesthetic preferences and choosing a company that might match those aesthetic preferences, whatever they may be. A lot of people might have gotten into BJDs because they saw these dolls and for a split second they were like, is that a person? There's a lot of dolls that look super realistic, but certain dolls look more realistic than others. Probably the first company that comes to mind when I think of a realistic doll, just straightforward from the way it's sculpted, is Eiffel House. Eiffel House has a wide variety of male and female sculpts that are a little bit more realistically styled. I mean, there's still a degree of stylization, but they're less anime than most sculpts. Another company whose dolls, depending on the sculpt, are a little more realistic is Dollmore. Ultimately, however, if you want a super hyper-realistic doll, you're going to have to sort of put in the work in the face-up, in the hair, in the clothing. The final factor really in making a doll look realistic, if that's your thing, is customization. If you're not at all into realism and you actually prefer anime-styled dolls, then hey, you're in luck. A lot of the companies in this hobby cater to that aesthetic taste. Off the top of my head, some of the doll companies that have more anime-styled sculpts are Volks, Fairyland, Zoom, and Lutz. However, if you don't like any of those companies or they're out of your price range, then really there's a ton of more anime-styled companies to choose from. Now, if you're not into realism, but you're not into anime, then maybe you're into some of the more extreme fantasy styles. Some companies with more fantasy / sci-fi / whimsical type sculpts are Zoom, Doll Chateau, and Doll Zone. However, there's a ton of artist dolls as well that are really diverse in style and can have sort of more extreme shapes, more extreme faces that you're not going to see in your standard doll company. You might also look into buying a more standard style doll and then buying fantasy parts. Fantasy parts can be ordered from anywhere that really fantasy dolls can be bought. Fantasy parts can be anything as tame as angel wings, which you can even buy from Fairyland, to limited edition fantasy parts from a lot of, I think Zoom has a lot of limited edition fantasy parts that people often sell secondhand. A lot of companies release that more fantasy styled aesthetic, usually as an event doll. The company that more consistently puts out fantasy dolls is definitely Zoom. Let's say you want more extreme proportions but not necessarily a fantasy doll, quote unquote. A lot of Doll Chateau's basic sculpts have very stylized bodies and faces that would go really well with anyone that wants something that looks just a little creepy. And if you want more stylized without the sort of creepy factor, Doll Zone is kind of like a more toned down version of Doll Chateau. So let's say you've looked at all these companies and you've looked at all these different styles and you decide that human dolls just aren't doing it for you. What are you gonna do? Well, of course there's a ton of dolls that cater more to anthropomorphized preferences. I'm talking about anthro dolls. There's a lot of companies and parts of companies that specialize solely in anthro dolls. Pipos, Dear Mine, Eileen Doll, and Lutz's Zuzu lines. These companies offer dolls with a wide variety in the level of anthropomorphization, from really cute chibi cats to full-on cat ladies with very feminine feline features. Anthro and fantasy dolls tend to have an overlap, however, and you'll often find that more fantasy-oriented doll companies will also have a few anthro and animal dolls that they also put out. Hujo also carry anthro dolls. However, most of these are made of ABS plastic and would be considered off-topic for Den of Angels. Still available in a ton of really cute colors and a great starter BJD. Whatever style or aesthetic you're going for, it of course helps that you pick a doll or a sculpt that matches that aesthetic. Ultimately, however, it's more up to you customizing the doll or whoever you hire to customize your doll. Something you should also consider when deciding on your doll, whether deciding what aesthetic you want or whether deciding your price range, is size. The classic sort of joke question to ask is, does size matter? In the BJD hobby, it kinda does. Size can impact a lot in the doll hobby. It can affect the availability of props and clothing, it can affect the price range for that sort of size of doll, it can even affect how the joints go together on the doll, and ultimately how the doll's aesthetic goes together. Size is kind of a big thing to consider when you're buying your doll. I mean, if you live in a 10 by 10 apartment, you're not going to be collecting like huge dolls, because I mean, storage is often an issue. I keep all my dolls kind of in their boxes and sort of Tetris together in a stack in one corner of my room because, hey, I'm working with a 10 by 10 space. I'm going to explain to you some of the more broad categories of doll size that are commonly referred to in the hobby. Terminology I'm going to use is kind of common speak for these sizes, but isn't necessarily what each doll company calls that size range, because they like to throw on their own labels for each size category and even their own sort of measurement restrictions for each size. The sort of buzzwords that I'm going to use for each size, SD, MSD, were actually coined by Volks and have kind of become the sort of catch-all terms for those sizes in the hobby. SD stands for Super Dollfie, and that really just refers to a Volks-specific sculpt. Nonetheless, these terms are kind of universally used. So the biggest doll size that's usually seen is SD. SD corresponds to roughly 1/3 scale. Basically, your average human shrunk down to 1/3 of their size. The stylization of these sculpts usually corresponds to sort of a more adult or even young adult, older teen age group. You're not going to see a lot of children that are SDs. Dolls in this range are usually from 60 to 70 centimeters. Some companies separate their SD sized dolls into two categories, with one going up to the mid 70 centimeter range, and some even going as low as like 55, 56 centimeters in the smaller bracket. This is currently the only SD sized doll in my collection. She's a Soul Doll Queena head on a Doll Chateau youth body. Yeah, youth. That's not even their biggest category. She's huge, as you can see, and has jointed hands. She's currently the largest doll in my collection, and even though I have another SD coming on the way, she's actually on the smaller side of things. She's a Doll Zone minus, and she's around 56 centimeters, I think. So she's definitely small for an SD and really small compared to this one. She's naked because I thought she would be smaller because I've only ever collected MSDs, and nothing I bought fits her. The next doll size category is MSD, or Mini Super Dollfie. This corresponds to roughly a 1/4 scale doll. Most MSDs are around 40 to 45 centimeters, although some dolls, like Doll Chateau's kid line, are up to 50 centimeters because they have like crazy extra joints, and a lot of the popular mini fae from Fairyland are like 38 to 40 centimeters. Most MSDs you see are going to be teens, not very many like adult looking MSDs. Usually it's like teenager or even like adolescent, although it often depends. There's a category called slim or mature MSD, which usually proportionally is more mature, as the name suggests. Mature or slim MSDs take different clothing than your standard MSD, so definitely read the label and read the measurements when you're buying clothes. The MSD size in particular has come very far from what it started as. Volks MSDs usually correspond to pre-adolescent looking dolls, whereas a lot of the newer sculpts are older teens, definitely mini-fays with their like huge boobs, especially the Moe line. They have sort of mature proportions and are considered slim MSDs, and especially their torsos are a lot thinner than their chubby counterparts, as I've often seen it labeled. This is Ray. She's a Leek World Reika. She was my first doll ever, actually. and my first MSD, of course. You can see that she's a lot easier to hold on to than an SD, a lot smaller than an SD, and even the scale is different. Her hand is a lot smaller, her waist is a lot smaller, just everything about her is scaled down a ton. MSDs, I find, are a really good starting size because the face is really easy to face up, easier than like a tiny, but it's not as unwieldy as an SD. Consequently, I think that an MSD would be the biggest doll that I would ever want to carry around with me somewhere, probably more travel size than an SD, while maintaining the more mature physique. Next up, we have the YoSD category, which stands for Young SD, or Young Super Dollfie. As the name suggests, these sculpts tend to be stylized so that they look a lot younger than any of the bigger size categories. The styles can range so that they look anywhere from like 5 to around, 12, 13. YoSDs are usually around 20 to 30 centimeters in size, and you don't get a lot of variation from this. YoSDs correspond to roughly 1/6 scale. This scale is where you start to find bigger dollhouse furniture and doll-sized props that are in scale. As you know, this is Yai. She's my little Fae Mio. She was my first ever YoSD, the one that sort of broke my little self-imposed no YoSDs taboo. Yeah, I saw her full set and I couldn't not buy her. As you can see, she's a lot younger looking than my other dolls, a little chubbier in the body, not as like developed body. She has these tiny little kid feet, and she just overall looks way younger than any of my other sculpts. Also, she fits in my hand. At this size, however, you start to get a little more challenging with making clothes, making shoes, and doing face-ups because you're working on such a small surface. Still, they're really cute and I recommend them for anyone that wants sort of a pocket-sized doll to travel with, or that just wants to get a feel for BJDs for the first time. A newer category in YoSDs is the mature or slim YoSD. Like the slim or mature MSD, they're more mature looking than their more traditional counterparts. This is, however, a very new category, and I would compare them in size and scale to your average Monster High doll. Slim YoSDs are also 20 to 30 centimeters, but unlike their more childlike counterparts, they tend to be anywhere from 1/8 to 1/12 scale. The slim YoSD category is being popularized by highly stylized sort of fantasy doll brands like Doll Chateau and Doll Zone. This is sort of an example of a slim YoSD that I own. She's a Doll Zone Zora, her name's Wish, and this is her next to my Venus McFlytrap Monster High doll. As you can see, they're relatively the same size and scale. The Monster High doll is a little bit more stylized because she's a fashion doll. The jointing is definitely a different system, but they're similar in height. I mean, your average slim YoSD is not going to be as tall as Zora because most Doll Chateau dolls tend to be a little taller than the average. Slim YoSDs are therefore a really great alternative for someone that wants a more mature bodied doll, but who isn't ready or doesn't have the space to have an SD or an MSD size doll. The final category of sizes I'm going to talk about is the tiny category. YoSDs and tinies are often lumped together, but I think to avoid confusion, you can treat them separately because they kind of handle differently. Tinies are usually anywhere from 1/8 to 1/12 scale, but they maintain that sort of pudgy, childlike proportions. They usually actually look like tiny little fairies or toddlers, or even young children. Tinies are also usually heavily stylized because at that tiny size, jointing tends to become a little more difficult and has to be scaled down a little bit to make it handle well, but at the same time look good. This is the teeny tiniest doll I have. She is a Doll Chateau Ada, and she came to me actually as the result of a raffle. She has these tiny hands and feet and these tiny joints. She's a lot more slender than your average tiny doll. Don't let her antlers fool you. She's she's actually like the teeny tiniest doll, and she fits very much in the palm of my hand. My thumbnail is bigger than her hand. I think that really speaks to the tiny, tiny aspect of this size category. This is a more traditional example of a tiny doll. He looks pretty much like a baby. He's a Hujo, but I'm not sure exactly what sculpt because I won him at an event. His proportions are entirely baby-like. His joints are teeny tiny and not all that complicated. And he is made of ABS plastic, so he kind of handles differently than resin would. However, for ease of customization for someone just getting into the hobby, maybe you start with a larger surface or a practice head before deciding to do face-ups on such a tiny, tiny surface. Or order with the default face-up from the company. As you can see, I have laid out all my dolls of various sizes, so you can get an idea of how different they are in scale to one another. I have also included one of my Monster High dolls because I find that they're an easier frame of reference to come across as the average person than, you know, an actual BJD. Here we have my Venus McFlytrap being roughly the same size as a YoSD, but obviously the scale is entirely different. You can't even really compare the size of your average MSD with a Monster High doll. The scale is just completely different. The size is so much bigger. And then when you jump from MSD to SD, it's even crazier. I mean, look how huge that SD is compared to those two. That SD makes a Monster High doll look like an ant. Even making the little jump from SD to MSD is monumentally different, both in size and scale, and you start to get details like jointed hands when you go to the SD and MSD scale. Doll Chateau has jointed hands for their MSDs and SDs, and this is just an example on my Doll Chateau youth body. I've also always found hands to be a really good indicator of scale. Here we see that the Hujo Tiny and my Doll Chateau Tiny, while roughly the same size, have, well, very different body types, but also very different hands. With Doll Chateau's tiny hands being sort of more slender and Hujo's tiny hands being more pudgy. Comparing this to Monster High hands, and you see that they're pretty much the same size, but definitely different scale. On the larger end of things, Monster High hands are roughly the same size as YoSD hands, but definitely not the same scale. The YoSD is sort of pudgier, more childlike, whereas the Monster High is more splayed, stylized, and more mature. Then we make the jump to MSD, and the hand is more mature, more slender than the YoSD hand, but also like twice the size. Bear in mind, however, that Minifays have sort of smaller hands than this, and LeakWorld's N-body, art body, has pretty huge hands. So you're gonna get not a twice the size hand usually going from YoSD to MSD, but I mean there is a size difference obviously. Going from MSD to SD, we see a definite difference in the proportions. This scale is scaled up, obviously, but you know, the style of the hand is relatively the same slender fingers, the same mature contours, basically young adult or teen or adult hand. Here are all the hands as compared to my hand, like your average human hand. Basically teeny tiny hands. Monster High hands are pretty standard. I mean, everyone kind of knows what Monster High hands look like. YoSD, we see that they're kind of like the size of one joint of my finger. MSD, you're starting to get a little bit bigger than you're used to seeing on like fashion dolls. And then finally at this like SD sized spider looking hand, we've got a pretty considerable size. Also the jointing is pretty interesting and you don't see that in other types of dolls obviously. So yeah, even the joints are huge compared to my hands. Like, that's 1/3 size. The SD size hand is the size of my tiny little Dolce Ada's body. That's about it for today. As usual, thanks so much for watching, and I encourage you to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video and found it helpful. I'll be back again next week with a video on basic care for your BJD, and I hope that you'll stick around to watch it. Have a good one. Bye!